In 1991, A Link to the Past defined Zelda. It created the conventions that the series would adhere to for 2 decades. Zelda has taken many forms since then, with many of the series' entries demonstrating how malleable the formula established in A Link to the Past truly was. The game still stands tall as one of the series' definitive entries, even after all this time. 20 years later, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. While it was acclaimed by many, some criticism was directed toward its handling of the established Zelda conventions, and the voices of criticism would grow louder as time went on. To this day, there is still ongoing debate over whether or not it were the conventions themselves that were showing their age, or if it was Skyward Sword's fault. Personally, I felt it was a mixture of both, and its issues were far more nuanced than I had been led to believe when it first released. Despite people still enjoying and discovering the Zelda games of the past to this day, the series would stagnate if it were to continue on the same path, and even the development team was feeling a little burnt out designing Zelda games in the same manner each time. Despite each game's uniqueness, it seemed inevitable that they would eventually just gravitate towards changing the very foundation that Zelda was built on, rather than just how it was utilized. Skyward Sword just happened to be the catalyst. During the development of Skyward Sword, 3 members of the team that developed Spirit Tracks were working on another 2D Zelda game. Designer Hiromasa Shikata and programmer Shiro Mori came up with a prototype involving Link merging onto walls. This concept led to a wealth of ideas for how it could be implemented in puzzle solving and exploration. However, the impending launch of the Wii U led to these people being reassigned to other projects, putting development on hold. Skyward Sword released in the time that the project was shelved, and with reception to that game sinking in, Aonuma was inspired to revive the 3DS project shortly thereafter, as it could potentially serve as a testing ground for the future of Zelda. With a promising foundation and a desire to rethink the conventions of the series once again, the team got to work. At Shigeru Miyamoto's suggestion, the game became a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, utilizing the same map in an effort to re-establish Zelda's conventions in a familiar setting. The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds was the result of their efforts, and it was released at the end of 2013. A Link Between Worlds let players tackle dungeons in any order they like after reaching the Dark World, and it allows them to rent, purchase, and upgrade nearly all of the game's items at their leisure. This alone made discovering the world feel liberating, as you could go virtually wherever you wanted, so long as you could solve puzzles and beat the bad guys. The wall merging mechanic was ingenious, and it settled into every facet of this game's design. Its utilization of A Link to the Past setting doesn't just satiate a craving for nostalgia. It is used to reward your knowledge of that game and challenge your expectations. It's not perfect by any means, and it does shed light on the difficulty that comes with restructuring Zelda to be non-linear, but it was still an exciting look into what was to come for the series. In this video, I wanted to explore why this game was so beloved when it first released, how it stacks up to A Link to the Past, and what the results were from its attempts at redefining, or at the very least reconsidering, Zelda. I'm Liam Triforce, and this is a video about The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. Before we begin, we need to discuss something that has been hanging over my head for a while. Some people took issue with my assessment of A Link to the Past's timelessness in my video on the game. Although this had a lot to do with my sloppy writing style 3 years ago, and I definitely do things differently now, I think there is some truth to what I was trying to convey. Like I said in the video, I think it is absolutely a timeless game. Like a lot of Super Nintendo games, it has aged beautifully, and there isn't anything about it that feels indicative of the era it was released in. But in the face of the many Zelda games that have all tried vastly different things, games that have iterated on the conventions A Link to the Past established in their own ways, it might not feel that way to some people. Even though I absolutely love A Link to the Past and it remains one of my favorite Zelda games, this is something that I still think holds true. Now, I have statistical evidence that I wasn't spouting nonsense in that video. In preparation for my video on Breath of the Wild, I published a survey that asked for people to outline their feelings toward every single Zelda game that they have played, as well as vote on which games they felt handled certain aspects best. I might delve into more detail later, but for now, I wanted to focus on A Link to the Past's presence in the results. Despite the reverence that people hold for it, it was not the most beloved game in the poll. Although it had a decent presence in the individual responses to which games had people's favorite elements, it paled in comparison to the other games in the series. You might think its unpopularity had to do with people not playing it, but more people have played it than Skyward Sword, and it's about on par with Twilight Princess. Its lack of popularity in the individual design categories had nothing to do with too few people playing it, and has more to do with which games were people's introductions to Zelda, and which games they prefer. Precisely because A Link to the Past was the first of its kind is why it feels less impressive to some in comparison. There's a lot of nuance to this, of course, as each person is bound to have differing stances on the series as a whole. Perhaps they didn't like the game's high level of difficulty, as certain attacks deal 3 hearts of damage, and you are only able to attack in 4 directions. Perhaps they felt lost and confused due to the game's detailed and largely open-ended overworld, and prefer more linear Zelda games. There are many different angles to consider, and some go into further detail in the written response section of the survey when detailing their favorite and least favorite Zelda games. This survey, however, was emblematic of just how distinct every person's stance on the series can be. With each Zelda game feeling unique, so too are the opinions. That's just how special Zelda is as a franchise. So why am I bringing all of this up? Well, with Zelda moving in so many different directions and many players favoring specific things, I believe A Link Between Worlds had the potential to serve as a fresh start for the series when it first released. With the game's dramatically revamped structure yet familiar setting, it would be both an exciting gateway to the series for new players, as well as a refreshing palate cleanser for those that wanted to see new life injected into Zelda. Although not quite as extravagant and dramatic as storming into the castle basement in A Link to the Past, I've always been a huge fan of how A Link Between Worlds introduces itself. At first, you're tasked with delivering a sword to Hyrule Castle, and the overworld music is a peaceful take on the Zelda melody we've all heard a million times before. For the first time, a handheld Zelda game is able to match the high-fidelity audio of the console Zelda games, and it is used to great effect. While composer Ryo Nagamatsu felt that the dynamic range in a performance from a live orchestra would be unsuitable for the 3DS speakers, the music still sounds awesome. A Link Between Worlds' soundtrack, from its atmospheric dungeon compositions to its outstanding battle music and nostalgic arrangements, might just be one of my favorites in the entire series. It's amazing how much it is able to convey, and how high quality it is despite the limitations of the 3DS's speakers. Things go awry when Yuga sends one of the sages into a painting, thrusting you into the adventure at the request of Princess Zelda. In the beginning, the game is structured like A Link to the Past. With the map being the same, you can still use your extremely limited abilities to find secrets and seek information based on what you know about the game that inspired this one. Although the rewards won't always be the same and new challenges and puzzles often await you, you will still be rewarded for interacting with things that you might remember from A Link to the Past. Once you reach the Eastern Palace, things start to deviate from the norm. This period of the game allows you to get used to navigation, exploration, and basic sword combat, but you'll soon reach a roadblock that tells you to seek out Ravio, who begs to sleep in your house and then has you rent items from him in exchange for a bracelet that smells like a wet dog. This deal feels one-sided somehow. Anyway, after receiving the bow, you'll be able to enter the Eastern Palace, which introduces you to the general flow of dungeons in a similar manner to A Link to the Past. While its challenges focus more on the things that A Link Between Worlds builds on, like depth perception and tighter combat, it does harken back to A Link to the Past's Eastern Palace in some areas. But just as you might think the dungeon is leaning too heavily on nostalgia, the bracelet you received from Ravio saves you from Yuga's trap, and you are formally introduced to A Link Between Worlds' hallmark feature, the merging mechanic. At the press of a button, Link will merge onto any flat wall, and you'll be able to walk directly left or right along that wall until you either leave the wall or your magic meter runs out. It is no exaggeration when I say that merging into walls is one of the most well-utilized and seamless mechanics across the entire series. Just the Eastern Palace alone gives you a taste of what it's capable of as you attempt to clear the dungeon by climbing around the outside. Depending on the level of elevation, you can reach so many different platforms and find new routes seemingly everywhere. There are several design elements that come together to create wall merging puzzles, whether they be the wall formations themselves, moving blocks that you have to connect and cross on the fly, isolated platforms that have you examining the world from various angles to find the right level of elevation. I was constantly trying to find new things with this mechanic. Dungeons utilize it in their own ways too. The Tower of Hera, for example, features the multiple floors and lateral thinking of A Link to the Past's version of the dungeon, but you'll also be using the hammer to ascend to different floors both inside and outside of the dungeon, as well as merging into the wall, crossing moving platforms, and circling around the tower in order to scale it. The Thieves' Hideout has you merging all over the place to hit switches and create paths for you and this girl to reach the dungeon boss. Reminiscent of A Link to the Past, but it has its own identity. Turtle Rock has you exploring this non-linear cohesive sandbox and connecting different elements of the dungeon together through these paths and switches. And these paths also allow you to achieve higher levels of elevation and unlock more paths through merging. Its non-linearity already made it one of my favorite dungeons to piece together, but the merging just makes it even sweeter. Also, certain areas and secrets from A Link to the Past that are normally accessed through portals have been reinvented to require players to merge with walls in order to reach them. And sometimes you'll need to go through the fissures that transport you between Hyrule and Lowrule to solve puzzles, which effortlessly replace the portals and magic mirror from A Link to the Past. Essentially, the merging mechanic is seamlessly integrated into every single aspect of this game's map design, and it never stops giving you new perspectives from which to view the world around you. You'll see even more examples of how well merging is utilized as we go on. After clearing the Eastern Palace, Ravio allows us to rent out all of the game's items at any time so long as we have the rupees to spare, with the exception of the Sand Rod, which needs to be discovered first. Considering how much I loved the Sand Wand in Spirit Tracks and how you could manipulate the sand beneath your feet to solve puzzles, it was funny to see how they tease you with this item throughout the game. For as low as 50 rupees, you can rent an item from Ravio. You can rent as many items as you want at a time, but if you die, every item that you've rented will be returned to Ravio. After acquiring all 3 pendants and gaining access to Lowrule, Ravio will allow you to purchase the items that you've rented for 800 rupees, and purchased items do not leave your inventory when you die because, well, you own them. The only exceptions to this rule are the fire and ice rods, which cost 100 rupees to rent, and 1200 rupees to purchase due to their significant power in combat. Purchased items can also be upgraded if you search for the baby Maya-Mais hidden throughout Hyrule and Lowrule, which can be found if you use your abilities and items to follow the sound of their distinctive squeaks. For every 10 Maya-Mais found, you can upgrade an item you've purchased, and these upgrades can be mouth-watering when it comes to making your journey easier. Once upgraded, the bow can shoot 3 arrows at once, the Sand Rod's paths of sand last longer and go farther, the Ice Rod devastatingly drops 4 ice shards at once, the Boomerang multiplies and moves faster and farther, the Hammer does twice the damage and has a wider radius, and the Fire Rod is disgustingly good. It carries enemies in a fire tornado and deals a consistent string of damage as it goes along. It decimates nearly anything in its path. It is well worth the investment of 1300 rupees and 10 Maya-Mais. The biggest draw of this system is the ability to rent items at your discretion and clear dungeons in any order you want after reaching Lowrule, which is intriguing on its own because it gives players free reign to just get lost in exploring the game's world for secrets. But with rented items returning to Ravio upon dying, it also introduces a level of risk to each dungeon, and asks players to prepare for the unexpected by gathering empty bottles to store potions, and collecting heart pieces with their rented items. Even if you save right before you enter a dungeon and die within, you have to ask yourself whether or not renting the items again is a better option than redoing the puzzles you've already solved. With this in mind, you might be wondering why you wouldn't just want to carry the only items necessary. Well, if you happen to have other items on hand in dungeons that don't require them, you can find unique solutions to both combat and puzzles. Because dungeons can be cleared in any order, the game only considers one item at a time when designing puzzles. It's not like other Zelda games where each subsequent dungeon you explore will consider the items you've obtained from previous dungeons. As such, bringing other items into each dungeon aside from the one required can result in some pretty cool scenarios if you decide to get creative. In Turtle Rock, there was a Wizrobe located in between this fence and an elevated platform, which prevented me from using my Ice Rod and attacking from above. But by throwing a bomb, you can sneak an attack in between those 2 platforms and take it out early, unlocking a new piece of the center pathway. These scenarios don't just pertain to combat, you can also find entirely new solutions to problems this way. In Turtle Rock, you're supposed to solve a series of wall merging puzzles in order to reach this key. But if you freeze this seesaw here and use the hookshot at just the right angle, you can skip the puzzle and grab it right away. With the ways in which items can make dungeons easier, sometimes it's worth weighing the risk versus the reward. This also plays into managing your rupees and spending them wisely as you progress through the game, as you might need to fall back on potions to stay alive, and in the race for rupees, you'll find yourself digging deeper into the overworld and dungeons. Let's talk about the dungeons though. In my video on Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, I mentioned that each dungeon is already mapped out once you enter it, removing a layer of discovery and memorization that other Zelda games carry when you have to search for the dungeon map and memorize the layout. Well, A Link Between Worlds is the same way, but things are different this time. The dungeons take advantage of the game's non-linear structure. The puzzles and challenges are inventive, the theming in each dungeon is far stronger than those games, and even when they take heavy inspiration from A Link to the Past, they still manage to do their own thing. I've already mentioned the Eastern Palace, Turtle Rock, and the Tower of Hera, but let's talk about the others. The House of Gales is home to a completely original concept not derived from A Link to the Past. While the Tornado Rod is a mostly situational item, the dungeon puts it to good use, as you'll have to jump over obstacles, time jumps to land on moving platforms, and merge into walls at differing levels of elevation after solving puzzles. Skull Woods still features the multiple entrances and exits of its Super Nintendo counterpart, but it takes on its own identity otherwise. The only item required to clear this dungeon is the lantern, which isn't even an item you rent from Ravio. It's a permanent item that you receive before you meet him. The rest of your items, however, can really come in handy if you know how to use them well. I've used the Tornado Rod to jump over fire and stun enemies, as well as my upgraded bow to shoot enemies from afar as I walk across narrow terrain. They also use 3D Space well, as you have to trick the wall masters floating above you into slamming onto switches out of your reach. And there are also plenty of cool merging puzzles. You can just assume that all of these dungeons do them well, to be honest. I don't really need to elaborate on every single one. The Dark Palace carries this unsettling atmosphere, as if you've stepped into a funhouse from hell. You have a considerable degree of freedom to map it out yourself, but it's still intricately designed, with multiple paths between each floor, and a central theme of finding a balance between light and complete darkness to find the way through. The Desert Palace builds on what I loved about the Sand Wand and Spirit Tracks. Your paths of sand can only be sent out in a straight line, but this makes figuring the dungeon out more challenging as you not only walk across the sand, but also merge along the walls of your sand paths and avoid obstacles. The sand plays into virtually every puzzle and combat scenario across the dungeon, including the boss, which I found to be one of the most challenging to keep up with. I also want to mention that each of Lowrule's dungeons do have permanent upgrades hidden within, and they are entirely optional finds. You can find Master Ore for upgrading your sword, the Hylian Shield for deflecting magic attacks, and the Blue Mail, which cuts the damage you receive in half. There's also a Magic Meter upgrade, which is a godsend for all of your items and the duration of your wall merging. All of these upgrades are tricky to discover and require you to explore beyond the scope of a dungeon's progression, but they are well worth collecting. Then there's the Ice Ruins. When I first got to this dungeon in 2013, I remember dreading the experience. I intentionally left it for last as soon as I realized the dungeon was ice-centric, due to my distaste for the Ice Palace in A Link to the Past. I didn't elaborate on my feelings toward the dungeon very well in my video on that game, and sometimes I made statements that were just completely false. The game does make it apparent that you'll need magic early on, both when you decide to use the Fire Rod and through Sahasrara's hint at the beginning of the dungeon. I think I must have been lazy when making that video because I didn't even cut my magic consumption in half, even though I knew where to make that happen. Let me attempt to explain myself again. Link's poor controls on ice permeate the entire dungeon, yeah, but the layout and enemy placement feel like the entire dungeon is working against you with the controls in mind. Backtracking is also a problem both when you figure out how to acquire the Blue Mail and when you need to reach the boss room, which forces you to trek through areas multiple times to that puzzle involving the blue and red switches, and walking all the way around to push the correct block down to hit the right switch and proceed. If you come prepared with magic potions and halved magic consumption, it's not as much of a burden to deal with enemies. It's mostly the layout and movement that I hate in this dungeon. Anyway, in contrast to the Ice Palace, the Ice Ruins ended up being great. For one thing, you have 360 degrees of control on icy terrain thanks to the 3DS Circle Pad, but it also takes the philosophies of the Ice Palace from A Link to the Past and transforms them in ways that play to the strengths of this game. There are still many floors to explore, but now there is an elevator between them, and you can connect pathways by solving puzzles to link different portions of the dungeon together in a non-linear fashion. They still make the terrain difficult to traverse through narrow pathways and pitfalls, but in a manner that still allows for proper control. There are secrets everywhere in this dungeon, in seemingly every crack and crevice of every wall. It feels like a strong summation of everything that A Link Between Worlds does right, packed into a harrowing, vertical dungeon that honors its predecessor, rather than cheaply imitating it. As already established, the game reuses the map of A Link to the Past. This means that the distinctive areas that made A Link to the Past's Overworld so memorable are still here and accounted for. Not every secret is identical, and most caves feature entirely new challenges, so it doesn't feel as redundant as it should. A lot of the time, your memory is a useful tool in locating secrets, but that's as far as it goes. as both the actual caves and side quests are almost always different. The biggest difference in how the overworld is utilized comes when you have to locate different parts of Lowrule and access dungeons. Lowrule is divided into separate areas, with each area only being accessible if you find the right fissure in Hyrule. Once you enter it, you'll then have to familiarize yourself with a distinct portion of the world. Before the Dark Palace, you'll have to navigate through a stealth section by walking and merging around these guards. Before the Desert Palace, you'll have to merge between Hyrule and Lowrule whilst creating paths for yourself in the sand. Before the Ice Ruins, you'll have to navigate up through a series of platforms that mirror Rosso's ore mine in Hyrule. These areas give significant identity to the world of Lowrule beyond mirroring A Link to the Past. And on top of being fun to solve, they are also home to heart pieces and other secrets if you are willing to seek them out. Because you can tackle the overworld in your own way, this also means you can collect the game's heart pieces at any point, so long as you know how to discover the area and you've at least rented the item you need. This makes the overworld tantalizing to dive into as you go through the game, and reinforces the game's non-linear structure once again. The only thing that matters before you enter a dungeon is if you feel adequately prepared. It's all up to you to discover this world. This is evocative of a philosophy that drove the original Legend of Zelda, and had gradually been buried by the series' adherence to the conventions that gave Zelda a firm structure. With all of these elements coming together, dungeons that invite player ingenuity, freedom to explore the world at your leisure, a risk versus reward in maintaining and upgrading your items, and an intrinsic desire to explore underlying all of this, I believe this game features one of the strongest gameplay loops a Zelda game has ever had. At least, that's how I felt on my first playthrough. A Link Between Worlds was an important step for the Zelda series, but moving away from the structure we've come to expect from Zelda had some unfortunate side effects. One of the biggest pieces of criticism I've seen toward this new structure was the fact that dungeons don't contain the items that they revolve around for you to discover. Instead, you enter the dungeon with the item required, and as mentioned, the map is already available to you. Dungeons also only require one item to complete, like I alluded to previously. While the optional applications for your other items bring a layer of depth to the game, it also removes a layer of depth from problem solving, as the dungeons can't consider the other items in your inventory aside from the lantern. The general flow of a dungeon in previous Zelda games, enter the dungeon, assess your surroundings, find the item, and discover new ways to interact with the dungeon before solving it and reaching the boss, was something that needed to change in order for A Link Between Worlds to work. But the form it has taken on does away with the satisfying progression that previous Zelda games delivered on. As an example, let's look at the Swamp Palace. This is a fun dungeon to explore, and definitely a high point when it comes to water dungeons in Zelda games, thanks to its central mechanic not being too annoying to deal with. But its use of the hookshot got me thinking about the lack of a progression in ideas and difficulty. It has these cool puzzles where you can navigate across water on a raft by pulling yourself with the hookshot, and the different water levels can affect how you traverse. There's also these designated spots where you can hookshot a wall and merge with it, which is a neat way to traverse the dungeon and solve puzzles. These ideas just kind of appear throughout the various rooms with no build-up or sense of cohesion. The ideas don't intersect with one another very much, leaving the dungeon feeling off. Then again, even if you had that build-up, it might not have gone over swimmingly in this game's structure. On top of that, because the dungeons can be completed in any order, there's no sense of progression and difficulty between them. Only one item is required per dungeon, and they all have to feature different puzzles on a similar level of challenge, which is something that the non-linear design of this game unfortunately has to carry with it. You're not progressing from the Deku Tree to the Spirit Temple, for example, and they cannot factor in the items you've collected up to that point because they have to keep the game free-form, which leaves it feeling shallower as a result. There are also caveats to the overworld focusing primarily on just heart pieces, rupees, and Maya-Mais. It was necessary to reward players with rupees in order to have them play into the rental system, but A Link to the Past still has this game beat when it comes to rewarding exploration. In A Link to the Past, you could find optional upgrades like the Cane of Burna, which casts a protective field around you, the Magic Cape that lets you pass through certain obstacles and become invincible for a short period of time, the Screen-Nuking Bombos Medallion, the Ice Rod, the Magic Upgrade, the Sword upgrades. Even fast travel across Hyrule was a reward for exploration. Granted, the system in place in A Link Between Worlds is far more accessible, but it felt great to be rewarded like this for finding the flute and using it on the weather vane in Kakariko Village. Instead, most of the optional upgrades are found in dungeons, which is fine of course, but I would have preferred a stronger balance. If anything, the primary element that leaves the game feeling shallower than previous Zelda games is the lack of progression in how you discover things in the world. In A Link to the Past, when you come across something you might not have the means to access, you can memorize it and come back later once you discover the applications of an item in a new dungeon. You gradually unlocked new parts of the world until you eventually mastered it. In A Link Between Worlds, you're just going in guns blazing. And while I feel the game does evoke a sense of wonder in doing this, a sense of wonder that the original Zelda game carried and few are truly able to emulate, I just miss the way other Zelda games were designed. Basing the majority of the game's design on A Link to the Past is both beneficial and detrimental to what the game is trying to achieve. As much as I think my memories of A Link to the Past serving me well makes for some awesome scenarios in the overworld, it does wear out its welcome on subsequent playthroughs. I think we're at a point where my memories of A Link to the Past are best suited to solving a randomizer seed. I can use my knowledge of the game to seek out as many secrets as possible, and collect the items necessary to solve each dungeon at a random order each time. With an infinite number of seeds to tackle and harder settings to master, the Link to the Past randomizer is an ever-changing gift that continues to challenge my knowledge of a game I already love. And because you're still finding the items necessary to unlock other parts of the world, it carries that puzzle box feeling that A Link Between Worlds lacks, since all of the items are available from the word go. Personally, I feel a lot less inclined to put these design aspects under scrutiny when playing in hero mode. Although taking 4 times as much damage may seem daunting, it encourages players to put their memorization to the test, and chart an optimal route through a non-linear game. You could challenge yourself to retrieve the stamina upgrade early by heading to the Ice Ruins as your first or second dungeon, despite the risks in doing so. The risk versus reward in hanging on to rented items is immediately heightened. When A Link Between Worlds first released, I achieved 100% completion without a second thought. I loved the game. When I replayed it a second time, it felt less impactful because I knew where a lot of the items were. The game was much easier than A Link to the Past, and the structure of the game did away with certain things that made previous Zelda games so compelling to gradually explore and unlock. But now that I've seen what hero mode can do for a game that I already know so well, the desire to find optimal routes and optimize my attack and defense for the steep damage penalties, the increased risk when renting out multiple items versus the liberating utility they offer, as well as your memory always being your ultimate weapon, I can honestly still say that A Link Between Worlds is an excellent game. That said, it does not invalidate those negative feelings people might hold toward the structure of this game, and they've always been on my mind as the series moves further in that open-ended direction. It may seem like I'm jumping back and forth here, but changing something as well established as the Zelda formula is guaranteed to come with both exciting new prospects and disappointing omissions. And I believe A Link Between Worlds both benefits and suffers from its shift to non-linear design. This shift means that elements that define Zelda in the past, elements that people still hold a strong attachment towards, will have to be left in the dust. The game was designed like this by choice, and that means sacrifices had to be made in the pursuit of change. This brings us back to the very debate that Skyward Sword brought to light. With a new sense of direction that aims to revitalize the Zelda series, what do they maintain, and what do they abandon? How far would the team be willing to go in order to achieve change? And in the end, could we still call the final result a Zelda game? When A Link Between Worlds was released, I was visiting New York City with my family. Although I was enamored with the city from what I'd seen of it in films and video games, exploring it in person was a totally different story. So there I was, headphones on, playing through it for the first time in the heart of the city. In the Milk Bar, you can have a pair of musicians play you some familiar Zelda tunes for a small fee. As I listened to their performances, I couldn't help but reflect on how far the series had come, and how it was undergoing big change, just as I was encountering change as well. Life was becoming more intimidating and more complicated. I had to adapt to my newfound responsibilities and somehow get by. The only constant in my ever-changing world was my hobby, making YouTube videos. But as I strived to find an audience, I realized that I would need to change and adapt my videos to new formats without losing out on the core of what made my videos intrinsically unique. With what I'm doing now, how long can I keep this up? How long can I keep doing the same thing? I mean, I'm almost done with the main Zelda series, and although I always plan on keeping Zelda on the table, future videos on the series will have to take on different forms. That said, I'm also talking about the way I make videos in general, How long will this be sustainable? Will I have to reinvent the way I do things at some point in order to keep people interested? This is why I empathize with artists that are forced to adapt and survive like this. People like me have to branch out and refocus, both to follow their passions, as well as make a living. It is not an easy task, and I will no doubt face problems if I do so. I will be challenged in the creative process, my financial responsibilities, and by those that value my work. But I am where I am now, because I choose to try new things, and I don't plan on giving up. This is true for The Legend of Zelda. It has always strived for each entry to feel different from the last, despite adhering to the same foundation each time. Now, with that very foundation being challenged, they find themselves in a difficult position. If they rebuild that foundation, what will they have to let go of? And can they live with leaving those things behind? It's an exceptionally difficult balance to strike, but with how much fun I was able to have with A Link Between Worlds despite lamenting the missing elements of previous Zelda games, I knew they were on the right track. I respect this game so much for what it attempted and achieved, and it's something I know I'll revisit in the coming years. Even if it means leaving the past behind, and even if it means not everyone will embrace their idea of change. So long as the spirit of Zelda is intact, I am open to whatever this series wants to be. A Link Between Worlds is built on experimentation and change, both in its structure and mechanics. These things are a constant throughout the entire Zelda series. They're things that needed to happen in order for the series to move forward. Without experimentation and change, we may not have received entries like Majora's Mask or The Wind Waker. A Link Between Worlds demonstrates what is possible in a non-linear Zelda game, and it would serve as an important step in the creation of the next. I've been Liam Triforce. Thanks for watching.